Hi everyone, it's Cameron in Berlin. I know we normally show up in your feeds on Fridays. That will also be the case this week. 2 new segments you can expect then, but first, we wanted to release a special midweek episode, one that is focused on US President Jimmy Carter. We actually recorded the podcast a couple of years ago when Carter first entered hospice, and as these things go, we record a lot of different segments, some of which we try to keep on file. We happened to forget that this one existed, and so we missed his funeral and the date of his death. But still, it's an interesting conversation about some of his counterintuitive achievements and his misunderstood legacy and the general era over which Carter presided as president. So we didn't want to hold it back from listeners. I think there's still plenty here that's interesting. So without any further ado, here's our segment on U.S. President Jimmy Carter. Adam, I guess to start with inflation. Inflation obviously was a problem before Carter took office, and it remained one while he was in office. And I guess I wanted to ask, what exactly was the toolkit for tackling inflation that Carter inherited from his predecessors? I mean, in previous podcasts that we've recorded, we've talked about how Nixon imposed wage and price controls. Is that something that Carter took up himself? I mean, what was the plan that he otherwise came up with for dealing with inflation?
This really is a fascinating and historically profoundly consequential question, which folks have been coming back to a lot recently, given that we've now been facing the most rapid inflation rate since the 1970s. And the Carter presidency is widely taken, I think, to be pivotal because it's out of the late 1970s and early 1980s that what we take today to be the basic policy instrument assignment emerged. And when we talk about a policy assignment in economic policy, we mean the allocation of a particular tool of economic policy, in this case, the interest rates of central banks, to a problem, namely inflation, as opposed to another sort of problem. It could be growth or investment, for instance. And the model with which we entered the inflation crisis, which has been affecting the world since 2021, 2022, was essentially that emerged in the late 1970s under Jimmy Carter, because in 1979, Carter appointed Paul Volcker to the Fed. And Volcker is the paradigmatic inflation-fighting central banker who is willing to use interest rates and the blunt force instrument of a recession, surging unemployment triggered by rising interest rates, to end inflation. But that is absolutely not where Carter started. And that is the tragedy, if you like, of his presidency, what makes his presidency so protean, because Carter himself and the Democratic Party at the time and the intellectual community around Carter was indeed shaped by earlier understandings of how inflation should be fought. And those consisted, above all, of ideas around wage and price control and negotiating deals with employers who set prices and also wages, and trade unions that struggle to raise wages, as direct methods, if you like, for trying to regulate the surge in prices. Nixon was granted, American presidents, after all, don't get these powers from nowhere. Nixon was granted powers of price control in 1970, faced with the first rise in prices, by a Democratic-controlled Congress. Remember that we're still in the era in the 70s where Democratic control of Congress is the norm because of the still very powerful representation of the Democrats, not just in the North, but in the South as well. And the Democratic Congress passes legislation which enables Nixon to impose price and wage controls. People, generally speaking, were surprised that he did. It was almost like a poison chalice they offered him, and he took it up. And Carter inherits that legacy from the earlier period, but by 77, when he comes into office, there's already considerable disillusionment with that model of price and wage controls as an effective mechanism for controlling inflation. It was cumbersome, it was bureaucratically difficult, and above all, interest groups would cluster around the price and wage regulations to defend their positions, which made it very difficult to actually conduct concerted top-down inflation control using that mechanism. But the central question for Carter from the very beginning was, if you're not going to do powerful World War II style wage and price controls, and even during World War II, they were difficult. And if Carter is no union man, he's one of the last great Southern Democrats, if you aren't really content with negotiating what's called a corporatist bargain between employers and trade unions, what are you going to do about inflation? And what we see in the first 2 years of the Carter presidency in 77 and 78 is a sort of, one has to say, I think, floundering and incoherent effort to find other mechanisms for controlling inflation. So one of the things they do is to move towards deregulation. They move towards trying to push investment to raise productivity, supply side methods, if you like, to control inflation. The two things that Carter is really averse to going towards are, first of all, using interest rates, urging the Fed to stick up interest rates and raise unemployment and thereby end inflation. And he's averse to that, A, because he is a social liberal and is deeply concerned with the unemployment rate and its impact on American society. And I think of the idea of trading unemployment against inflation as essentially cynical and odious. He's also a man of principle and opposed deliberately interfering in the business of the Fed. So he doesn't want to be pushing the Fed to do things. The Fed has to decide to do it of its own accord. But Carter, though he's a fiscal conservative, is also averse to using fiscal policy to control inflation because he sees the power of government as a positive thing in many respects where public spending can in fact benefit society at large. So that leaves him really with one potent tool for dealing with inflation, which will be tax increases, and those are quite difficult to push through. And the story of the Carter presidency is really the working through of this impossible problem. 78 is really the moment when the fall of 78, when the inflation problem is becoming not just an American but a global issue. America's inflation is beginning to destabilize the dollar. So then we begin to see within the Carter administration a move by various officials towards advocating tougher fiscal policy. Carter's own fiscal conservative instincts begin to kick in. And then the truly sort of dramatic shift comes over the summer of 1979 and the fall of 1979, where, for want of anyone else, really, Paul Volcker emerges as the candidate to take charge of the Fed. And in October 79, he then pushes through this draconian interest rate policy, which explicitly includes, in Volcker's case, this is well documented, precisely the odious bargain between unemployment and inflation reduction that Carter had resisted on principle up to that point. And so it's really this sort of stumbling towards what everyone at the time can already see is a blunt force, socially inequitable mechanism for controlling inflation, which defines the Carter presidency.
It's a very useful summary. I do want to return to the deregulation policies that you mentioned there. This is widely cited as a big part of Carter's economic legacy. Could you summarize the sectors of the economy that Carter set out to deregulate? And then curious if you could give some kind of genealogical account of this deregulation push, because I'm surprised that this was a big interest of Carter's at a time when the Democratic Party had a big kind of social agenda and was known for supporting big government. So was this just a kind of specific personal interest of Carter's, or was there a bigger faction of the Democratic Party that was pushing for deregulation like this?
Yeah, Carter is, in retrospect, I think, a highly consequential president, not just for the shift in regime or macro policy that happened on his watch, but with regard to microeconomics, with sectors. And these are two very different ways of looking at an economy. One is to look at it holistically, and that's Carter had some pretty big name economic advisors, and that's their natural métier. But the president himself seems to have been much more focused. He was himself obviously a small business fan, famously legendary, a peanut farmer. He had experience of government regulation firsthand in one of the most tightly regulated sectors. And this made him an advocate of deregulation on the grounds of his social liberalism, right? Because the understanding he is indeed, an inheritor of the New Deal legacy in democratic politics. But by that point, 40 years on from the 1930s experiment, there was a considerable build-up of criticism of the regulatory state as antisocial, because captured by the business interests who existed in an incestuous relationship with the administrators and lawyers that regulated their sector. And so Carter did indeed vigorously push or support deregulatory initiatives that were coming forward sector by sector in a variety of key industries, namely energy, oil, trucking, railroads, airlines, and perhaps, for many people closest to their hearts, beer, which, believe it or not, was a tightly regulated industry. And the craft brewing revolution of the last half century, which many of us enjoy the fruits of in the form of, craft IPAs and so on, is a product of that deregulatory moment. It's pretty difficult to imagine, I think, just how grim the beer landscape of the United States was in the early 1970s. In fact, I have some memories of it as a kid from visiting the US from Europe and secretly stealing Budweiser cans from summer barbecues, only to discover that A, it was disgusting, and B, it didn't really make you drunk in the way that you anticipated. So there was a big agenda to push there. And it's not confined to Carter himself. So he had personal motivations, but things don't happen in the American political system because the president says so. And they happen because you have broad-based coalitions working through Congress, at this time still in a bipartisan way, and at the regulatory level and at the ideological level. And Carter was a figurehead for that push. And their aim collectively is to use market forces in the spirit of sort of the market liberalism of the day to deregulate encrusted, inefficient, antisocial, government-backed monopolies in the private sector. And it's difficult for us today in an age notably of a highly liberalized European air travel, to imagine just how anti-competitive, exclusive, monopolistic, and therefore overpriced, notably airline travel was in the United States in the 1970s. So this is where this agenda comes from. If you stand very far back, I think what's really striking about this era is that it is perhaps the decade in the wake of Watergate in which business lobbying was held at greatest distance from politics. It's quite difficult, in fact, to think our way into this because we assume, in retrospect, that the deregulatory agenda was pro-business, because that's where, obviously, the neoliberal agenda of market reforms ends us up in the 80s and 90s. Head-turningly for us now, in the 1970s, deregulation was a progressive, not anti-business move, but it was a move to streamline and improve the government so that it would be less amenable to business capture. And so this period in which campaign finance reform was pushed in a more dramatic way than in any period since in American history was one in which politics actually operated with a degree of autonomy in relation to business, which for us now, in the age of these fundamental Supreme Court rulings on the ability of capitalist business interests to influence American politics, can seem very remote indeed. But this is why both the post-Nixon Republican Party and the Carter administration could converge on this agenda of deregulation. It was, in a sense, a backlash against the corruption revealed by the Nixon administration and a desire to find a better, somewhat less dirty political model for the US.
Interesting. So I guess if there was this kind of consensus on deregulation and deregulatory issues, I'm curious about fiscal issues more broadly and more, I guess, specifically in the Democratic Party. Was there agreement on issues like social policy and welfare, or was there a kind of more tension and ferment? I mean, what was Carter's stance on those kinds of fiscal issues, like a federal jobs guarantee, which I think was also a topic of consideration at that time in Congress?
Yeah, this again is an area where there's a sort of need for a revisionism with regard to the kind of popular image of Carter. And in this respect, we can draw on the work of a whole generation of my historian colleagues who have offered us, I think, a dramatically different vision of the Carter administration, the one that populates notably the Republicans' narrative of the 70s, which is that Carter was a big government liberal, he was high spending, he ran up huge deficits, and then along comes the reforming presidency of Ronald Reagan that imposes discipline, ends inflation, strips back government, and so on and so forth. And that pretty much inverts the truth of the situation. Carter inherited small deficits by our modern standards from his predecessor Ford, who was reacting against the period of considerable fiscal austerity under Nixon in the late 60s and early 70s. And Carter doesn't blow those deficits out. Why not? Because he is a devout, seriously minded fiscal conservative, unlike, one has to say, the Reagan people that followed him, who were supply-side economists who believed that really the deficit would take care of itself if only you could stimulate growth. Carter was not in that kind of mindset at all. And he was an advocate of heavy redistributive taxation if necessary. So you also had a tool with which to do something about deficits. Again, something the supply side Republicans strip themselves of because they become die-hard opponents of any tax increases. And so Carter, for instance, pushes through the windfall tax for the oil industry as a quid pro quo for the deregulation of the sector. So Carter is a fiscally responsible president, much more in the image of a Clinton or an Obama than of a Reagan, a Bush, or a Trump. And this also puts him at odds to a considerable extent with the left wing of his own party, which, as you say, Cam, in the wake of the civil rights revolution of the 1960s, looking desperately for ways to address the disadvantage of black men and women in American society in the labor market, and faced with the rising unemployment of the 1970s as deindustrialization begins to bite, hone in on this issue of unemployment as a key issue of social justice, economic efficiency, and racial justice. And so there is a coalition of Democrats pushing in the 1970s, and the set piece of legislation is the Humphrey-Hawkins Act, which goes through successive iterations, but all of which are essentially about trying to define a maximum unemployment target, or put it the other way around, the minimum level of desirable employment, and to make the Fed more accountable in its policy decisions for prioritizing not just inflation control, but also full employment. And out of this emerges the Humphrey-Hawkins Act, which is signed into law in 1978 by Carter, which we think of as the origin of the dual mandate of the American Central Bank, honored in the breach by the Paul Volcker chairmanship of the Fed, but nevertheless providing an anchor for a more complex monetary policy than we see, for instance, in Europe, in the ECB, which is a one-eyed inflation-fighting central bank. So this, again, is something that emerges from the ferment of that period, but it's worth saying that Carter himself was the Democratic presidential candidate who was at greatest distance from the Humphrey-Hawkins agenda. His economic policy advisors were quite worried about the inflationary implications of adopting a too ambitious unemployment target. They thought they would be giving hostages to fortune, and this would exacerbate the inflationary spiral. It took considerable debate within the Democratic Party coalition to bring the White House on board around Humphrey-Hawkins. As a result, the ideal unemployment target, which was between 4% and 5%, was watered down somewhat. There isn't a jobs guarantee in that legislation for a whole variety of different reasons. It had very little chance of passing, but also Carter was not approving of that kind of role for government. But nevertheless, again, this is a period in which the Democratic Party coalition was willing to discuss a much broader agenda. And by our standards today, Carter was well to the left of where the Democratic Party would end itself up by the 90s and the early 2000s. On the labor market specifically, though he opposed jobs guarantees, Carter was certainly willing to put more money behind youth training, for instance, so as to address the labor market participation issues which have remained with us in the last half century in the United States. And notably, of course, also to address the issues of racial inequality around that. But the Carter administration it's worth emphasizing this, both conservative with regards to the standards of the day and remarkably radical and open-minded in its thinking by the standards by which, later history would judge Carter. The history that came afterwards was really that of, to a degree of, if not a counter-revolution, then a retreat from ambitious reformism for sure.
Well, one thing that happened in that interim between the Carter administration and today was this process of globalization, which has sort of come up a little bit in our discussion so far. But yeah, obviously Carter's time in office overlapped, I guess, at least with the beginnings of that process. So yeah, how did he contribute to that? Did his foreign policies actually help push globalization along?
Yes, it's a truly fascinating era. Again, one which is attracting the work of some of the most brilliant young researchers in the field of American political economy. The 1970s are really, they're pretty hot stuff and have been for a while now. And in part, indeed, because this is the emergence of a new world order. We have, the opening of the door to communist China is obviously the most consequential thing in the early 1970s with Nixon and Kissinger's visit. And Carter continues that with the normalization of relations between the United States and the People's Republic. Normalization, however, should be put in inverted commas. Again, this is still small steps by comparison with where we will end up in the 90s and the 2000s. It's the era of, rather shy ping-pong diplomacy and principled discussions about how far one can go in recognizing the PRC. The issue of Taiwan emerges for the first time. And as always in the United States, this is not simply a matter of the White House dictating. This is, hugely complex coalitional politics involving congressional actors as well. And it isn't in the first instance economic as far as China is concerned. Why? Because though it obviously has a bright future, it very much has that ahead of it at this point. China in the 70s is in the turmoil of the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution. It's an extraordinarily poor place. Share of global GDP, depending on how you count it, in the single digits, 2, 3, 4%. Tiny, tiny, tiny by comparison with the colossus we know today. So Carter was, however, deeply involved with globalization, just not with China. I mean, he was famous as the governor of Georgia for having opened rather ambitious trade offices for Georgia, both in Brussels in Europe and in Tokyo in Japan. So it's really a European and Japanese version of globalization that Carter addresses, and he does so with enthusiasm and with a characteristic sort of modesty and openness. He's not a American president who pretends to hegemonic leadership when he knows that America is in such poor shape. But Carter is a regular of global economic diplomacy. Within days of his inauguration, he sends his vice president, Walter Mondale, to Europe and Japan to negotiate over economic policy. And as an expression of the kind of rather freewheeling and refreshing policy ambition of the period, what the Americans are negotiating with the Europeans and Japanese about is global fiscal policy. So the idea is that if you conduct stimulative economic policy in just one country, the benefits leak out, and the country in launching the fiscal policy benefits less than it should, and the overall impact of just uncoordinated policies is less than could be achieved if all of the governments of the world stimulate simultaneously, because that would create positive feedback effects and spillover effects for everyone. They call it the locomotive theory. The idea is the most powerful global economies, the Japanese, the Europeans, and the United States, Germany in the lead in Europe, should take the lead in growing the entire world economy in a coordinated way. One of the reasons they're open to this is that globalization starts with an experience of crisis in macroeconomic terms. There are, of course, the benefits of having much more efficient Japanese cars and so on. But the opening is the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, the collapse of the monetary policy currency link, which had tied the global economy together. And when that goes, a lot of people are worried about descending into the anarchy of the 1930s, retreating from globalization, retreating towards protectionism. And so there's a lot of deliberate thinking about how to coordinate the world. And the locomotive theory is the version of this. And it has a concrete expression in terms of global sociability, because from the mid-70s onwards, the leaders, finance ministers, central bankers of the world begin meeting in what we take for granted today as the current schedule of globalism. And Carter becomes a regular and prominent figure at the so-called G7 meetings, which is a combination of European, Japanese, and the American governments. And he isn't just somebody who's handing out lessons. What is really striking about this period is that the Americans appear not if exactly a supplicant, then at least a sort of not more than a partner, and not obviously first amongst equals. The Germans, notably under Helmut Schmidt, I think, imagine themselves as first amongst equals because their currency is stable, the Deutschmark is riding strong, the Bundesbank is the model of how central banks ought to be organized before the Fed comes back in the 1980s under Volcker. And so, notably at the Bonn summit in the summer of 1978, we have this really still, in some ways, I think, historically unusual situation where a modern American president almost takes lessons from other people. Now, this is obviously terrible PR for Carter, and I'm putting it in a deliberately caricatured way because he's a formidable person, really, in his own right, and could certainly stand up to a bully like Helmut Schmidt if he needed to. But it's a kind of it's a fascinating global balance, and it's quite consequential because the Carter administration, really from the summer of 78 onwards, thinks of itself almost as answerable to the other members of the G7, G8 to do something about the inflation problem in America, the weakness of the dollar, and the underpricing of oil in America. But this is how far the external commentary on American policy goes in this period, into the nitty-gritty of domestic American legislation. You've got to reform America domestically such that your foreign balance with the rest of the world will come into equilibrium, the dollar will stabilize, and then the rest of the world can be stabilized.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess to some extent that must be a reflection of Carter's own temperament and personality, and there's a pretty wrenching shift in the personality of the presidents after Carter, with Reagan coming up right after that with a very different kind of attitude, I guess, about America's role in the world. So I guess I would just point out that your discussion of Carter is this kind of very revisionist account, it seems to me, of his economic legacy. I mean, it's usually Ronald Reagan that's typically remembered as the economic revolutionary who inaugurated our current neoliberal era, as it's sometimes called, with this emphasis on open markets and deregulation, etc. So should credit really be given to Carter for starting this era that we're living in? I mean, is that his true legacy?
I think Carter presides over the period where the break happened. I'm not sure I would personalize this to a degree. I think, Carter himself would be horrified to be labeled as the first neoliberal president. I don't think that was his agenda. He wanted to strike a much more complex balance than what emerges as neoliberalism's default. But it's under his administration that the breaks begin to happen. And he was also an acutely sensitive and rather capacious intellectual in a sense. And what Carter also does is to formulate this shift in speeches. I mean, the 70s are a period of significant presidential speech making, again, something that one struggles in a sense to find immediate analogues for. But in two speeches, one on inflation in 78 and then the famous Malaise speech in 79, Carter really does try to sum up the scale of the challenge facing the United States and the way in which it must respond. Perhaps this is because it's the last great era of network TV, of the old TV model in which the president can command a truly national audience by speaking in that medium, and Carter tries to do that. But if we depersonalize again and step back also from America, it's clearly true that the late 70s and the early 1980s are the period in which the break towards a new model of political economy takes place. And more often than not, it is, let's say, in inverted commas, the left, the progressive side that makes this break, both conceptually and in terms of policy instruments. So if you think at Britain, it's the Labour governments. In Italy, it's the socialists with Craxi. In France, it's the socialists with Mitterrand in the 1980s. In Germany, it's the Social Democrats with Helmut Schmidt that really initiate this new era, which means that Thatcher and Reagan, to a considerable extent, are inheriting this model. And if we come back to parochially the American scene, it is indeed true that Reagan's deregulatory agenda is far more limited than that of Carter. I mean, he deregulates the bus system and then savings and loans, which turns out to be, in many ways, a catastrophic mistake. And on fiscal policy, neither Reagan nor Thatcher can really plausibly be claimed to be true fiscal conservatives. In fact, what we're seeing structurally is governments like the UK and the US with large domestic financial sectors discovering that you can finance huge trade deficits and big government deficits by a variety of, the mobilization of financial resources that gives you space to pursue rather, shall we say, unbalanced agendas, not so much of shrinking government, but of reducing the tax base. And that's really what, becomes the legacy of the 1980s, a much more freewheeling style of macroeconomic policy than anyone really imagined in the 50s, 60s, and even the 70s. We have this rather the wrong way around. The true disinhibited, who cares about deficits, sort of happy-go-lucky economic policy making, which we sort of take for granted today, is not an effect of post-World War II Keynesianism. Those people lived in much tougher times under much tighter circumstances, but really something that was learned by democratic politicians through trial and not so much error, but trial and getting away with it in the 1980s.
Okay, yes, we do need to leave this here. Obviously, we'll all be watching to see when exactly Carter passes. But yeah, we will leave the conversation there for now. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It's produced by Claudia Tatey, Laura Rossbrow-Tellem, Rob Sachs, and Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested in news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Listeners to Ones and Tooze even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code TOOZE at checkout. That's TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love getting your feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com or email us, podcast@foreignpolicy.com, or you can tweet us. That's at OnesAndTwosePod. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.